Good afternoon. Well, it's tough being the last set of speakers, but actually this presentation is a good presentation for the final set because a lot of what SCOPE does encompasses what was discussed earlier today. So we greatly appreciate the opportunity to speak here, and I'm reflecting and thinking, you know, this is the first investor symposium, and I think we can all look forward in 10 years to attending perhaps the 10th, and we can say we were there when. So thank you to Lineage and the Reeve Foundation for organizing this, and SCOPE is happy to be a part of it. And of course I can't see the arrows without my glasses. There we go. Okay, so SCOPE stands for the Spinal Cord Outcome Partnership Endeavor, and we are an affiliate of the American Spinal Injury Association, which is an organization that focuses on research, education, and care for individuals living with spinal cord injury. And we are an academic industry agency partnership. We were established in 2007, and our goals are to really enhance clinical trials via development of outcome measures and novel approaches to clinical trial design with the goal of validating therapeutics for people living with spinal cord injury. So SCOPE leadership, you will meet Jane Hsieh in a minute, who is the co-chair with myself of SCOPE, and our founding co-chairs were Andy Blight and John Steeves. So SCOPE consists of voting partners and members and represents probably about at least 20 institutions, 7 of which were speakers today at the symposium. So you can see the broad reach of SCOPE. Our partners span industry representatives from drugs, biologics, and devices, as well as a contract research organization, as well as private nonprofit funding agencies. Our members are also very diverse. We have academic representatives who are leaders in the field, again, many of whom spoke today, and represent major spinal cord injury institutions as well as governmental organizations. So SCOPE is a research enabler. We don't conduct primary intervention research, but we look at ourselves as enablers. So identifying a challenge and seeing where we might be able to provide some assistance in helping. And, you know, I mentioned our members and our sponsors, but we are small. We are small, but I would say mighty in that our scope is quite broad. So an area of focus is in outcome measures, and I'll go into a bit more detail on that, clinical trial design, which I mentioned, and we also address various needs that may arise. And Jane will talk about some initiatives we have that address things that have come up that we felt were important to address. So I don't need to go into any detail on this because MJ did an excellent job of presenting challenges in our outcome measures. So I won't go into that. But I will say that in addition to challenges with human outcome measures, we also have to think about our animal outcome measures, and I'll get into that in a moment. So as mentioned, outcome measures are a challenge. So what did SCOPE do in order to at least make some headway into finding solutions? So SCOPE has done extensive work participating in 2 workshops where we examined all upper and lower extremity outcome measures and subsequently published on these measures. And we not only looked at the measures, but we tried to understand where they should be used and when, and what some of their challenges were, and what needed to be done in the future. And an output of those workshops, in addition to the publications, was it was identified that we needed outcome measures that spanned ability of people living with spinal cord injury and were linear, and that actually resulted in MJ working on the development of the SCI, which she mentioned earlier. And the great thing about the SCI, it addresses SCOPE's goals both in outcome measures as well as trial design, because the SCI, if it proves to be a good measure, which I have no doubt it will, can be used for all types of spinal cord injury. So Michael spoke today about how we need different measures for different cohorts. SCI, being a linear measure developed using advanced statistical methodologies, should be able to be used for individuals of any neurologic level or severity and could be tailored to clinical trials because it is a linear, or it will be, a linearized measure. So that's an area where, again, SCOPE identified a challenge and worked on some solutions. I mentioned earlier that it's also important to understand animal work. And we've seen a number of presentations today with different animal measures that were presented. Michael did a very nice job with a table that compared what had been done preclinically with NervGen to what had been done clinically. And we really need more of that. And we really need to understand how our preclinical or animal measures line up with our human measures, how they line up and how they don't. And we need to do that at the early stages of the process. So SCOPE hosted a workshop in 2021 to really understand the alignment and malalignment, and there is a publication that will be submitted shortly in this regard. So what are some of the challenges in clinical trials? Well, they're not unique to spinal cord injury. Every complex problem has a simple solution, unfortunately, that doesn't work. Now that's maybe a bit of an overstatement, but in spinal cord injury, we've heard that this is a small indication, approximately 17,000 individuals with spinal cord injury per year. So a small population, it's very difficult to execute clinical trials. So we need to be very smart about the way that we execute them. So on this slide, actually don't focus on the big graphic in the middle, but focus on the right, because I'm going to shift a bit. So Michael Fahlings also spoke earlier about the need for adaptive trials or smarter ways to conduct trials. So the traditional manner in which a clinical trial is conducted is that a sample size is identified and that sample is recruited. Let's say it's 25 individuals. And once those individuals are recruited and their final data collection point has occurred, one opens the box and looks at the clinical trial data. So there's no learning along the way. Adaptive trials enable learning opportunities along the way with incoming data. And an example might be that you might learn that your therapeutic doesn't work in a subset of the population. With an adaptive trial design, you actually stop enrolling that type of subject. So it saves time, money is more efficient, and it also exposes individuals to less risk. It's not perfect. There are downsides to adaptive trial design, but SCOPE had a publication on adaptive trial design trying to encourage use of these designs in spinal cord injury. Now I'm going to shift to the complex image to the left. So spinal cord injury, you've heard from many of our presenters today, is biologically complex. There are many facets to spinal cord injury, from the initial injury to the secondary injury. And so it is likely that we will need combinatorial approaches. And these approaches can target protecting tissue from secondary damage, repairing tissue that has already been damaged, and also inducing plasticity of the tissue that remains. And we've seen examples of all of these today. What we do know is that rehabilitation is an essential component for a monotherapy or a combination therapy. So, and we've also heard that in some of the presentations today. So we sponsored a workshop recently in 2023 on combinatorial approaches to really encourage the field to move forward. And there are other groups who are doing this as well. Okay, so clinical trial updates and trends. I talked about challenges in clinical trials. So in spinal cord injury, we don't believe that there's such a thing as a failed trial. We believe that there's something can be learned from every trial that's executed, regardless of whether or not they met their primary outcome measure. So SCOPE, in combination with 3 nonprofit funding organizations, Spinal Research, which is located in the UK, Wings for Life, which is based in Austria, and the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation, which is based in the United States, we are hosting a workshop in September on lessons learned, highlighting upcoming, in progress, and completed clinical trials. And the focus will not only be on results, but also on the things that can be learned to inform future trials. That's really the focus of the workshop. We also believe that it's important to understand the trends in spinal cord injury research over time. So in the lower graphic, you can see an example of these trends, and Jane's going to talk a bit more about SCI Trials Finder, from which these data were derived. But we have a presentation at ISCOS coming up in October, and looking at trends in spinal cord injury research. And what you can see from this graphic here, and I don't know if, here we go with the pointer, is that clinical trials of rehab, drug, cells, and surgical, the numbers have stayed pretty consistent since 2016, but we've seen a massive increase in trials that involve technology. And again, I'm going to turn it over to Jane now.
Okay, as Linda said, we're a research enabler group, and when we look at problems that we face, we try to find a solution. Recruitment challenges are something that not only spinal cord injury clinical trials suffer by, but many other indications. So let me see here. So back in 2016, there was a meeting in Ittingen, Switzerland, that some of the foundations got together and organized to speak with scientists to see what the problems were in completion of our clinical trials. And recruitment was one of these problems that was identified. So we set to develop a website that would facilitate the matching of patients to trials. And in addition to that, we also wrote a sponsored manuscript that talked about recruitment issues in spinal cord injury throughout the history of our spinal cord injury trials. So for people just starting out on clinical trials, have a look and see what people did wrong and see what things can be done to improve. In the meantime, the website downloads all of its information from clinicaltrials.gov, which is the largest database of clinical trials throughout the world. We download that information, I believe it's daily, but the difference is that we have an expert curation committee that produces common language summaries of each trial so that any person who's interested in that trial, be it a patient or a caregiver or even a medical care provider who wants to provide information to patients, can understand what the trial is about, what is involved, what potential benefits could arise, and basically give them a very quick way to access the trial investigator with the push of a button. So hopefully that this website will improve recruitment in the long run. Some of the analytics that has come from this website, Linda showed the upcoming workshop on trends in clinical trials. Those analytics come from usage of this website, and we'll be able to tell which clinical trials patients want to participate in. So we'll be releasing information on the top 5 hits of clinical trials in SCI, things like that. Another need that we have seen emerge is in the area of biomarkers, and several speakers today have talked about the fact that SCI does not have an approved biomarker. The speakers before have also talked about why biomarkers are necessary and will help our efficiency of clinical trials. So again, back to the 2016 meeting in Ittingen, Switzerland, we identified that there was a need to understand what biomarkers are currently available, and as such, we SCOPE led three papers about available biomarkers. There's an error on this slide. So we talked about neurochemical biomarkers. The middle one's supposed to be neuroimaging biomarkers, and then electrophysiological biomarkers. And you can see that a couple of these publications received readership awards, so we're quite proud of that. But we do know that we just covered part of the story. There's a lot more that we haven't covered, and as such, at the next Asia meeting in 2024 in April in Puerto Rico, we will be sponsoring a pre-course of biomarkers, the whole spectrum from molecules to movement. And one major frontier that perhaps SCOPE has not been as successful in is the engagement of people with lived experience. And we've heard from many sources today, including the pros, Jared and Jake, that we haven't done a great job of that. And so that's something we're working on currently. One of the ways we're working on that, and thank you, Constantine, for giving the background, which I don't have to do, regarding the FDA's Patient-Focused Drug Development Initiative. This was a 2012 initiative in which the FDA invited patient-led discussions or organized meetings to hear the voice of the patient, to understand in indications where approved therapies were either non-existent or very sparse, as to what patients wanted, were we serving them properly, and how do we get there if we weren't doing so. It was such a popular initiative that 3 years later, in 2015, the FDA said, we can't do all of them, so we're going to allow you to do externally led patient-focused drug development meetings. So when we looked into this, spinal cord injury did not have something already organized. So SCOPE, being that we're very encouraged to move outcomes and clinical trials forward on behalf of people with lived experience, we engaged with the North American Spinal Cord Consortium as a start to start to plan for a patient-focused drug development meeting with the FDA. Without having a communication with the FDA, they don't know what we want. They don't, and we don't know what they need to allow us to get us what we want. And the first thing is to get the spectrum of voices of all the patients involved. So NASCIC is a good start. It will be up to them to get in touch with all of the advocacy groups and come together with a unified voice, and SCOPE, as a key stakeholder in outcomes in clinical trials, can feed back and provide support to this patient-led initiative to begin the communication with the FDA so that we can have something approved someday soon. So I didn't touch on everything that SCOPE is involved with. We only had 15 minutes. But we would love to hear your feedback about the work we're doing. If there are gaps or areas that you want some feedback on or to create a subcommittee about, please speak to Linda and I. But in the meantime, for what we did talk about today, please let us know if you have interest to get involved or any other work that you can feed back to us. So that's our contact information if you need to get in touch with us. Thank you for the opportunity.